Number 1. Jeffrey Brian Maurer was in his mid-50s when police in Rochester Hills, Michigan, found his parents, William and Gail, dead inside the family's garage in mid-January of 2015. To neighbors, the Maurers were a quiet, elderly couple who had raised their children in a comfortable suburban home and were considering a late-life downsizing. Jeffrey, unemployed and living with them, had a history that included mental health struggles and substance problems, according to court reporting. Behind closed doors, tensions over money and control were building, and the family's plan to move into a smaller place became a flashpoint that prosecutors would later describe as the spark for something far darker. In the weeks leading up to the violence, witnesses and investigators described a man slipping further into resentment and instability. Prosecutors argued that Jeffrey believed a downsizing would loosen his access to his parents' resources, and that he grew increasingly hostile about finances. Reports also referenced prior domestic volatility and long-standing behavioral issues. While the defense would later portray the killings as an impulsive outburst, the state framed the buildup as deliberate, a son calculating how to remove the obstacles between himself and his parents' savings. The crimes occurred inside the Maurer home. Investigators determined that William and Gail were attacked with household items at close range, including 2 hammers and a heavy tea kettle. There was no elaborate staging or attempt to create an outside suspect. Instead, deputies conducted a welfare check after a family member could not reach the couple, and they discovered the bodies in the garage on East Maryknoll. The proximity, the choice of improvised weapons, and the lack of any credible alternative suspect quickly narrowed the focus to the son who lived under the same roof. What followed was a swift investigation and a faster trial than many homicide cases. From the outset, Oakland County authorities alleged premeditation tied to financial gain. The defense countered with a claim of spontaneity and emotional collapse. Jurors heard about the family's planned move, the defendant's grievances, and the brutality of the attack without dwelling on graphic detail. Within days of testimony, a jury convicted Jeffrey of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. At sentencing, the judge called his actions reprehensible and a shock to the community, imposing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a mandatory term for the offense. Local and regional media covered the case intensely, emphasizing the vulnerability of the elderly victims and the community's grief. The psychological picture that emerges is one of converging pressures: middle-aged dependence, unresolved mental health and substance use history, festering entitlement, and a fixating belief that his parents' decisions threatened his stability. Prosecutors articulated a financial motive intertwined with control and resentment. The defense stressed impaired judgment and a lack of planning. The jury's verdict indicated it accepted the state's account of intent. Today, according to the Michigan Department of Corrections, Jeffrey Brian Maurer is serving life in prison at a state facility, with no eligibility for release. Number 2. Thomas Gilbert Jr. was in his early 30s when he walked into his parents' Manhattan home on a cold Sunday in early January of 2015. Friends from prep schools and elite clubs remembered him as a tall, poised Princeton graduate who drifted between startup ideas and leisure, supported by a comfortable allowance and an apartment paid for by his father, financier Thomas Gilbert Sr. Behind the public image of privilege, relatives and former acquaintances later told reporters about long-standing anxiety, eruptions of anger, and a dependence on his parents that hung over the household like a storm cloud. Prosecutors would argue that money, control, and unraveling mental health collided in the hours before the shooting. In the months leading up to the crime, pressure tightened. The elder Gilbert's hedge fund had endured lean stretches, and he began cutting back his son's expenses, including a weekly stipend and rent support. To the father, it was a push toward responsibility. To the son, it felt like a withdrawal of lifeline and status. Accounts introduced at trial described escalating conflicts over money, the son's inability or refusal to work, and episodes that family and friends interpreted as instability. The district attorney later said the dispute over reduced support was not a passing argument, but the central friction that hardened into motive. On the afternoon of Sunday, January 4th, inside the Beekman Place apartment, the sequence was chilling in its simplicity. Prosecutors said Thomas Jr. arrived, asked his mother to run an errand, and waited until she left. When she returned minutes later, she found her husband dead, and the scene arranged to suggest suicide, a placement investigators would quickly judge as staged. From the outset, detectives focused on the son, the friction over finances, the ruse that removed the only other person in the home, and forensic details that did not match a self-inflicted wound. He was taken into custody within hours, and in the weeks that followed, indicted on charges including murder in the second degree and criminal possession of a weapon. At trial in Manhattan, jurors heard dueling portraits. The defense emphasized severe mental illness, arguing that delusions and disordered thinking diminished responsibility. The prosecution returned, again and again, to planning. The errand that sent the mother away, the conflict over money, and an attempt to disguise the killing. After about 2 days of deliberation, the jury rejected an insanity or mental defect defense and found him guilty of murder in the second degree and related weapon counts. The presiding judge called him entitled, concluding the evidence showed a calculated act, and imposed a sentence of 30 years to life in state prison, the maximum permitted under the law for the combined counts. Media coverage was intense, not only because of the wealth and pedigree involved, but because of the starkness of the motive laid out in court. Psychologists and reporters who examined the record pointed to a familiar pattern: a privileged exterior masking profound dependency, a family trying to set limits, and a son whose identity was fused to financial support and status. In that reading, the trigger was not a single argument, but a prolonged collision between entitlement, deteriorating mental health, and fear of losing lifestyle and control. The verdict signaled that jurors believed he retained the capacity to plan, to deceive, and to carry out the act despite any illness. Today, Department of Corrections records and news reports place Thomas Gilbert Jr. at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, serving a term of 30 years to life, with parole eligibility reported for the mid-2040s.
It is very easy to tell who is very familiar with how we treat our very mentally ill. People such as journalists who have done deep research into it, clergy who have counseled families going through it, and families themselves. Every one of them speaks of it in the same way. It is worthy of a third world country with a harsh dictator or the Middle Ages. And our family situation is an example of that. As I have said many times in court, we have been trying to get Tommy into a hospital for 15 years. It's not a matter of whether he wants or doesn't want to take his medication. He is too sick to be able to judge. He needs to be in a hospital. Had he been so, my husband would still be alive today. The approach of the judge, her mentality of the whole thing was revealed almost immediately in court. During the fit for trial hearing, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance hired two doctors, let me start that sentence over again. In August of 2015, Tommy was evaluated by two doctors from Bellevue Hospital. They did a thorough examination of everything required of them. They determined he was unfit for trial. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance and his team decided that they wanted their own person, whom they use frequently, to evaluate Tommy. They got Dr. Stuart Kirshner, who, generously speaking, did not even half of the required steps for fit for trial. He did not read his indication that Tommy only suffered from a little OCD. His interview, which was in court, was only 37 minutes. It's supposed to be at least an hour. The OCD, I should have written all this. his assertion that Tommy suffered only from OCD meant that he had not read Tommy's medical records. His interview with Tommy was inadequate, and his conclusion was completely wrong. I will never understand why Judge Cyrus Vance and his team decided that was adequate work, and I will never understand why Judge Jackson went with his analysis. It makes no sense whatsoever. Her talk today in court is a reflection of that analysis and of her mentality. She has a reputation for being fair, but throughout these proceedings that has not been the case. Never once has my son, as Arnold Levine indicated, even begun to cooperate with his two different attorneys. That is one of the bedrocks of fit for trial. There is no logical reason for him not to work with his attorneys. The only reason is that he's too sick to be able to do so.
Well, what's next for
and anybody who cannot get through their own trial without having to be physically removed from the court by 3 guards is obviously not fit to be there.
Number 3. Muhammad Altantawi was a high school student in Farmington Hills, Michigan. 16 years old and living in a large family home with his mother, Nada Huranya, when their lives converged in a way that would devastate relatives on both sides. Friends and neighbors described Huranya as a devoted parent navigating a difficult divorce, a woman focused on her children and determined to keep the household moving forward. To those who knew Muhammad, he was a teenager caught between parents, struggling with expectations about school, future plans, and the family's changing dynamics. Investigators would later say those pressures did not land on him all at once. They built slowly, inside a house where ordinary arguments over curfews, school, and independence were growing sharper as the divorce moved ahead. In the months leading up to late summer of 2017, family tension reportedly escalated. Prosecutors would later argue that Muhammad resented restrictions and felt anger over his mother's choices in the divorce, reading limits on his freedom as personal rejection. Relatives described a teenager showing signs of volatility and defiance. Detectives and medical experts began to piece together those dynamics only after tragedy struck, placing them alongside physical evidence to explain what happened that August morning. The picture that formed was not of a sudden impulse, but of a household strained by conflict and by a young man who, in the state's telling, began to see control and obedience as a contest he needed to win. On a summer morning in late August, first responders found Nada Huranya on the ground outside the family residence. At first glance, the scene resembled a fall from an upper story, even a tragic accident. But an autopsy quickly changed the trajectory of the case. The medical examiner concluded she died before the fall, indicating she had been smothered inside the home and then thrown from a window to stage an accident. That stark medical finding transformed a puzzling death into a homicide investigation. Detectives focused on the teenager who lived there, built a timeline around his movements, and examined digital records and physical evidence that, in their view, undermined any claim of misadventure. The case went to trial years later. Jurors heard about the mother's divorce, the son's anger, and the forensic conclusion that the victim was already dead before going out the window. They weighed testimony about household conflicts and a prosecution theory that the scene had been staged. After deliberations, a jury in Oakland County found Muhammad Altantawi guilty of first-degree premeditated murder in March of 2022. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Members of the extended family spoke about loss, while the defense challenged the state's narrative and raised objections that would continue into sentencing. At sentencing in late September of the same year, the judge addressed the methodical elements the jury had accepted: suffocation, the attempt to disguise the death as a fall, and the underlying family discord. Reporters noted outbursts and emotional statements as relatives confronted the young man who, at the time of the offense, had been 16. The court imposed a prison term of 35 to 60 years, with credit for time already served in custody. Local media covered the proceeding extensively, highlighting the courtroom clashes and the profound grief of a family that had already endured a painful divorce and now faced a permanent absence. Psychologically, prosecutors framed the motive as a convergence of anger, control, and resentment tied to the divorce and to disputes about the teen's future, not as a sudden eruption but as a decision shaped over time. The jury's verdict signaled acceptance of that interpretation, reinforced by the medical evidence that the death preceded the fall. As of today, public records and news reports indicate that Mohammed Altantawi is serving a term of 35 to 60 years in a Michigan state prison. Number 4. Robert Bever was 18 years old and newly out of high school. His younger brother, Michael, was 16 and still a student. They lived with their parents, David and April, and a house full of younger children on a quiet street in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Neighbors remembered a private family that kept routines neat and predictable. Friends and teachers, when they recalled the older boys, spoke about isolation more than rebellion, long stretches online, few close friendships, and a sense that their social world existed mostly behind screens. Inside the home, rules were firm, and the parents expected structure. Prosecutors would later describe two brothers turning inward, reinforcing each other's darkest ideas until the line between fantasy and intent began to blur. Through the spring and early summer of 2015, that private bond hardened. Investigators later recovered digital traces that suggested planning rather than impulse searches about infamous crimes, notes about tactics, and a fixation on notoriety. According to the state's theory, resentment over parental limits mixed with a disturbing fascination for violence and exposure. The brothers fed on the same sources, and their conversations late at night, online, or whispered at home, became an echo chamber. There was no single explosive argument that outsiders could point to. Instead, the picture that emerged was of steady escalation, with the older brother cast as the strategist and the younger as the eager participant. Late on the night of Wednesday, July 22nd, in the family's two-story home, the plan moved from talk to action. The house was dark. Prosecutors said the parents were targeted first, then younger siblings, in a sequence that showed forethought: a cut phone line, attempts to control movement inside the home, and efforts to keep the scene contained. A teenage sister survived severe injuries, and when she could speak, she identified Robert and Michael as the attackers. A toddler was discovered physically unharmed. Officers responding to a frantic call arrived to a chaotic scene and began a search of the neighborhood that ended quickly. Both brothers were located nearby and taken into custody before dawn. Forensic work inside the house, the survivor's account, and items seized by detectives all reinforced an image of preparation. Charges followed in Tulsa County District Court. Robert, as an adult, faced multiple counts of first-degree murder and assault with intent to kill. He chose to plead guilty the following year, a decision that avoided a jury trial but cemented the most severe punishment available. Michael, certified to stand trial as an adult, went before a jury. The defense emphasized his age and susceptibility to influence. The prosecution answered with timelines, digital evidence, and the sister's testimony. Jurors returned guilty verdicts on all principal counts. Sentencing hearings were sober and closely watched by the community, with relatives of the victims speaking about loss and resilience. Experts who later reviewed the record pointed to a blend of isolation, adolescent malleability, and radicalization through violent online narratives. The state's account framed motive as layered: hostility toward parental authority, a desire to control the household, and a chilling hunger for infamy. Whatever the internal balance between the brothers, the courts concluded both acted with intent and coordination. Years later, reporting noted an additional prison incident involving Robert that resulted in more life terms, underscoring assessments of ongoing risk. Those later sentences did not alter his parole-ineligible status. Today, both brothers remain incarcerated in Oklahoma. Robert Bever is serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Michael Bever is serving 5 consecutive life sentences, along with additional years ordered to run back-to-back. Number 5. Daniel Simon Yacobi was a Los Angeles dentist in his mid-30s when his life and his mother's life intersected in a way that would haunt Beverly Hills for years. His mother, Violet Yacobi, was a 67-year-old widow known among friends for her devotion to family and for carefully minding the home she and her late husband had built. Outwardly, Daniel had the trappings of success: a professional degree, a polished demeanor, and the privacy afforded by an affluent neighborhood. Inwardly, according to witnesses later quoted in court and in reporting, he was adrift, unhappy in a career he felt pushed into, and simmering with resentment toward his parents. That conflict would become the foundation of the state's case. As the year of mourning for Violet's husband waned, strains inside the family intensified. Prosecutors described an emotional stew of anger, entitlement, and money questions. Friends recounted that Daniel had made comments about hating his parents and had asked acquaintances about inheritance taxes, inquiries that would take on ominous meaning after the fact. Investigators would also find troubling online searches in his digital history, including terms about chokeholds and choking-related deaths, which the state argued showed planning rather than panic. The prosecution's theory was stark. A son who felt controlled and dissatisfied decided to claim a share of his mother's substantial estate through violence. On or about Wednesday, October 10th of 2017, family members became alarmed when Violet missed a routine call about a simple errand. That evening, she was discovered inside her Beverly Hills home, unresponsive on the marble near the base of the staircase. At first, some wondered if she had fallen, an accident in an otherwise orderly house. But the coroner's assessment soon shifted the focus. The death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. What had looked like a tragic fall became, in the eyes of detectives, a staged scene. The investigation moved quickly toward the person with proximity, opportunity, and motive. Months later, Daniel was arrested and charged with murder, with a special allegation of financial gain attached to the complaint. He pleaded not guilty, and a long period of delays followed. At trial in the summer of 2025, jurors heard two competing stories. The defense maintained that Violet died from a fall, pointing to the location where she was found, and to the absence of certain signs they argued would accompany manual strangulation. The state countered with the autopsy conclusion, the pattern of Daniel's internet searches, testimony that he had voiced hatred toward his parents, and the timing of inheritance questions made in the weeks before Violet's death. After hearing evidence and argument, the jury deliberated briefly and returned a verdict of murder in the first degree, finding true the allegation that the killing was financially motivated. The portrait that emerged from witnesses and records was of a man burdened by professional dissatisfaction and an identity intertwined with parental approval and resources. Prosecutors framed the motive as greed fused with resentment. Analysts who reviewed the case described a collision of emotional dependency, career disillusionment, and the lure of sudden wealth. Whatever the precise balance of those factors, the verdict reflected the jury's acceptance of a planned act rather than a tragic misstep. On Friday, October 3rd of 2025, Daniel Simon Yacobi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment confirmed by county authorities and reported widely. Number 6. Antonio A.J. Armstrong Jr. was a Houston high school student, 16 years old, living in a townhome with his parents, Antonio Armstrong Sr. and Dawn Armstrong, and his younger sister. To the public, the family looked accomplished and close-knit. A former professional football player turned gym owner, an involved mother, and children active in school and sports. Inside the home, prosecutors later said tension had been rising over grades, marijuana use, late nights, and the ordinary boundaries parents set for a teenager who was pushing against them. Friends saw a charismatic kid who wanted freedom. Teachers and relatives noticed a household trying to keep structure in place as conflicts sharpened. By midsummer of 2016, pressure points multiplied. Investigators and, later, jurors heard about arguments over slipping academics, a grounding order, and strict rules that A.J. felt were unfair. There were also digital traces that sketched a fuller picture of the weeks before the shootings. In interviews, detectives said A.J. first denied touching his father's handgun, then admitted he had shown it to a friend and fired it weeks earlier. A small scorch on the stair carpet explained by AJ as dropped matches became, in the state's telling, another sign of risky behavior inside a house already on edge. These strands would matter when jurors were asked to decide between an intruder story and a planned domestic crime. Just before dawn on Friday, July 29, 2016, police arrived after AJ's call, saying he had heard gunshots in his parents' room and seen a masked intruder. First responders found both parents shot in bed. The account of an outsider did not square with what the house revealed. The security system was still armed when officers reached the door, and records showed AJ disarmed it to let them in. Doors and windows showed no sign of forced entry. Investigators noted a bullet hole that began in AJ's third-floor bedroom and pierced the ceiling into the room where his parents were found. Step by step, the physical layout, the alarm logs, and the lack of an escape route narrowed the focus back inside the family. What followed was a legal saga that stretched for years. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial, after days of testimony and long deliberations, also resulted in a mistrial. In the third proceeding, prosecutors brought new emphasis to the home's alarm data, the bullet trajectory evidence, AJ's shifting statements about the gun, and a minute sampling of his father's blood detected beneath a visitor badge sticker placed on AJ's shirt at the station. Evidence the defense challenged as contamination, but that jurors were allowed to consider. After roughly 10 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on capital murder. The psychological portrait that emerged in court was divided along familiar lines. The defense described an impressionable teenager, overwhelmed by grief and suspicion, insisting that a stranger had done the unthinkable and that the forensic gaps created reasonable doubt. The prosecution framed a different through line, a pattern of household conflict, a craving for independence, lies told to parents and police, and evidence that the scene did not support an intruder. Jurors heard about text messages, phone activity timelines showing when a device was unplugged in the night, and expert testimony interpreting the alarm records. In their view, those pieces aligned more closely with an inside job than with the shadow of a masked outsider. Public reaction mixed shock with fatigue after years of proceedings. Reporters who covered each mistrial noted the family's continued support for AJ and the community's grief for two respected parents. With the verdict in August of 2023, the law required a specific punishment because the defendant was a juvenile at the time. Life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. State corrections, records, and local reporting since then have placed Antonio A.J. Armstrong Jr. in Texas custody, serving that life term with parole eligibility only after 4 decades. Number 7. Grant Tiernan Amato was in his late 20s when he moved back into his parents' home in Chulawota, Florida, after a string of setbacks left him untethered. His father, Chad, worked in healthcare and was known as steady and disciplined. His mother, Margaret, kept the household organized and close. His brother Cody held a steady job and was the family's peacemaker. From the outside, they looked like a tight suburban family, trying to help an adult son restart. Inside, relatives later told investigators, the picture was more complicated. Arguments over money, rules about internet use, and a growing divide over how to set boundaries with a son who resisted them. Reporting and court testimony would later describe Grant as unemployed, isolated, and increasingly immersed in an online fantasy life that strained the family's patience and bank accounts. In the months leading to late January of 2019, pressure mounted. Detectives and prosecutors said Grant had become obsessed with a woman he met on an adult website and had poured extraordinary sums into that online relationship, draining family resources and prompting ultimatums at home. An arrest affidavit and local coverage described tens of thousands wired overseas, a failed stint in treatment, and strict house rules that barred him from further contact and demanded real steps toward work. Those limits did not hold. Evidence gathered by investigators included communications about the relationship, financial transfers, and family efforts to cut off access. What emerged for jurors was a portrait of resentment, entitlement, and a retreat into a digital world that collided violently with real life. On a cold Thursday in late January, deputies were dispatched to the Amato home after a coworker reported that Cody had not shown up. Inside, officers found Chad, Margaret, and Cody dead. Grant told detectives he had been away, then shifted to suggestions of unknown intruders. But the scene, according to investigators, did not match an outside attack. There were indications of staging, financial and digital breadcrumbs that pointed inward, and timeline inconsistencies. Analysts testified about electronics, activity, account access, and movements inside the house. The emerging theory was stark. The family confrontation over money and online behavior had escalated, and the killer attempted to deflect blame onto a murdered sibling. The case moved quickly from arrest to indictment, and by midsummer of that year, the trial opened in Seminole County. Jurors heard about the web of financial transfers, the family's interventions, and forensic work that prosecutors said undermined the story of an intruder. The defense urged reasonable doubt, arguing that investigators had fixated on Grant too early, and that the technical evidence left room for alternative explanations. After days of testimony, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder. In the penalty phase, the same jurors recommended life imprisonment rather than a death sentence. The judge imposed life without the possibility of parole. Reporters in the packed courtroom noted the surviving brother's grief and the community's exhaustion after months of headline. Psychologically, prosecutors framed motive as a convergence of financial desperation, dependency, and fixation. A son whose identity and solace had become anchored to an online persona and who viewed family limits as an existential threat. Court filings and testimony outlined a patterned deception about money, boundary setting by parents, and a slide into isolation that, in the state's telling, culminated in violence and an attempted cover story. Analysts emphasized that the case did not hinge on a single clue, but on the weight of many: transfers and searches, device activity, and the internal logic of the scene. Whatever the defense's alternative theories, the verdict signaled that jurors accepted the prosecution's account of planning and responsibility. Today, public records and local reporting place Grant Tiernan Amato in Florida state custody, serving life sentences without parole. Number 8. Andrew Wayland Beavers was in his mid-20s when he returned to his mother's quiet home in Tracy's Landing, Maryland, a bayside community where people notice when a neighbor's porch light stays on too long. His mother, Juanita Naomi Coyle Pillai, was a respected technology leader known for building teams, mentoring younger colleagues, and protecting hard-won privacy with the same care she brought to her garden. Friends described a devoted parent who had made room for her adult son as he tried to stabilize work and plans. To outsiders, theirs looked like a family navigating ordinary strains after a difficult year. Behind that calm surface, investigators would later say, lived an increasingly volatile relationship, marked by control, resentment, and emotional whiplash. Through early summer, small frictions compounded. Relatives and colleagues observed distance, then worry. According to prosecutors, Andrew's behavior grew erratic, and efforts to set boundaries inside the home were not holding. The state would later present a picture of escalating tension and private confrontations that left Juanita anxious but determined to keep the peace. That context mattered when, on a hot Sunday in late July, she suddenly stopped answering messages, an absence that friends and loved ones found immediately out of character. Deputies responding to a welfare call arrived at the property and began to follow what they described as a faint trail from the master bedroom toward the marshy edge of the estate. Searchers soon found Juanita's body concealed outdoors, and the medical examiner ruled the death a homicide caused by sharp force injuries. The evidence suggested a violent struggle inside the home and attempts to hide what had happened. The discovery transformed a missing person worry into a criminal investigation that moved quickly toward the person with motive, proximity, and opportunity. Andrew was arrested out of state within days and charged with murder. As the case proceeded in Anne Arundel County Circuit Court, prosecutors laid out a timeline anchored by physical evidence from the home, the concealment outdoors, and expert testimony from the medical examiner. The defense initially pursued a plea of not criminally responsible, contending that a mental disorder negated culpability. After hearings and a trial on responsibility, a judge found Andrew criminally responsible for the killing. A jury later heard the full case and, in early August of the year 2023, returned a verdict of first-degree murder, along with a related weapons count. Coverage at the time emphasized Juanita's standing in the technology community and the shock among friends who had worked with her on national security projects. The portrait that emerged from testimony and filings was of a household where a gifted, accomplished mother tried to steady an adult son whose behavior had become unpredictable. Prosecutors framed motive in terms of control and simmering anger. Not a single explosive event, but a pattern of escalating defiance that culminated in violence and concealment. Analysts who reviewed the record noted that the case did not hinge on one dramatic clue. Rather, it rested on many small, stubborn facts, scene reconstruction, movements inside and outside the home, and medical findings that rejected any claim of accident. In this reading, the psychology was a convergence of dependency, resentment, and a collapsing relationship between mother and son. At sentencing in mid-January of the year 2024, the court imposed life imprisonment for first-degree murder, with a concurrent term on the weapons offense. Officials announced the outcome in a public release. Local and national outlets reported it widely, reflecting the deep public sympathy for Juanita and the enduring grief of those who loved her. As of today, Andrew Wayland Beavers is serving a life sentence in Maryland state custody. Number 9. Todd Stephen Warner was in his early 50s when neighbors in Washington Township, New Jersey, noticed patrol cars outside the tidy home where his parents, Frank and Joyanne, lived quietly and talked often of retiring from their longtime salon business. Friends described the couple as generous and steady, the kind of people who waved from the driveway and doted on grandchildren. Todd had moved back in, a son in midlife trying to reset. What unfolded would shatter that image. Authorities later said he turned on the very people who had opened their door to him. Through the late summer and early fall of 2019, ordinary family tensions apparently deepened into something far more dangerous. Prosecutors would not ascribe a single spark. Instead, they traced a pattern of strain and dependence inside a household preparing for a new chapter. The parents, both in their early 70s, were only weeks from retirement. According to investigators, the son was adrift and had begun to rely on his parents for shelter and support. That fragile balance, they argued, collapsed in late October. On a Sunday evening in late October of that year, officers responding to a worried relative's 911 call entered the Warners' home and found Frank and Joyanne dead. Detectives quickly focused on evidence pointing inward: 2 baseball bats and a knife recovered by investigators, and the absence of forced entry. Within hours, attention turned to the son who was no longer at the residence. Authorities said he had taken a family credit card and the car. The next day, Pennsylvania State Police took him into custody at a casino across the state line, ending a brief flight that underscored, for prosecutors, both opportunity and motive. From there, the case moved swiftly. A Warren County grand jury returned an indictment, and in late summer of the following year, Todd Warner pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder in the first degree, along with related offenses that included fraudulent use of a credit card. The plea replaced speculation with admission. There would be no trial. Prosecutors emphasized that the couple had invited their son to live with them and were nearing a long-planned retirement when they were killed, a detail that resonated throughout local coverage. At sentencing in early November of 2020, the court imposed 2 concurrent terms of 36 years on the murder counts and a consecutive term of 5 years on the credit card conviction, an effective total of 41 years in state prison. Officials noted that the slayings had occurred just months before Frank and Joyanne planned to step away from their business. Reporters described a somber courtroom and a community still struggling to understand how a family home had become a crime scene. The Warren County Prosecutor's Office announced the sentence publicly. Wire services and regional outlets spread the news. Psychologically, the record that emerged was one of dependency hardened into resentment. There were no expert reports presented at trial, because there was no trial. But prosecutors framed the motive as a mix of deteriorating family dynamics and immediate self-interest, reinforced by the use of a stolen credit card and the flight to a gambling floor. The details: household weapons, a quiet neighborhood, a capture at a Pennsylvania casino added weight to a portrait of a son who chose escape over accountability until arrest made that choice moot. Today, according to public records and prosecutors, Todd Stephen Warner is serving a 41-year term in New Jersey state custody. Number 10. Kyle Lee Romy was in his early 40s, recently paroled and living with his mother, Denise Bryant, at her home near Goddard, Kansas. Neighbors knew Bryant as a steady presence who kept to routines and helped family where she could. Romy, by contrast, had a history of conflict and prior convictions that strained relationships and made his return home uneasy. According to local reporting and sheriff statements, the arrangement was meant to be a reset, a mother offering stability to a son, trying to re-enter everyday life. Through late summer and into early autumn of the year 2021, tension inside the house appeared to deepen. Authorities later said there had been arguments in the past, and the fragility of the living situation was obvious in hindsight. On a Wednesday night in early October, deputies were asked to conduct a welfare check after relatives grew worried about Bryant's health and could not reach her. That request set in motion a series of decisions that would turn concern into a homicide investigation. Shortly after 11 at night on Wednesday, October 6th, deputies arrived at the residence off the West U.S. Highway 54 corridor. No one answered the door. After calling hospitals and finding no record of Bryant, officers forced entry. Inside, they found Bryant with obvious signs of trauma. She was pronounced dead late that morning, and detectives began documenting the scene, gathering statements, and reconstructing movements around the home. The sheriff's office said the evidence quickly established probable cause to arrest her son, Kyle Romy. He was booked on suspicion of first-degree murder as investigators continued to collect forensic and witness evidence. From there, the case moved through the courts in Sedgwick County. Prosecutors presented a straightforward narrative: a volatile relationship inside a shared home that ended in lethal violence, with no credible alternative suspect. A jury found Romy guilty of first-degree murder in the late autumn of the year 2023. 2 months later, a district court judge imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole, until after 653 months, more than 50 years, citing the brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim in her own home. Local outlets reported the courtroom as somber, with emphasis on the brief timeline from conviction to sentencing. Psychologically, the record that emerged through affidavits, press briefings, and courtroom summaries was of dependency hardened into resentment. Romy had returned from prison to the care of the person most willing to help him, and the home became the crucible for old conflicts, control, substance, fueled volatility, and the constant friction of a midlife son living under a mother's roof. The state did not present an intricate motive theory so much as a pattern, highlighting prior family strife and the abruptness with which concern for Bryant turned into the discovery of her body. Analysts who covered the case noted that the prosecution leaned on scene reconstruction, the welfare check timeline, and the absence of any forced entry evidence. Public reaction was shaped by two details that resonated beyond the courtroom. Deputies forced their way in only after exhausting routine checks, and the victim was a mother in her late 60s who had opened her home to a son attempting a new start. Those facts anchored coverage in Wichita and statewide, where headline writers underscored the life without parole calculation in months, the jury's autumn verdict, and the New Year sentencing that confirmed the outcome. Kyle Lee Romy is currently serving life in a Kansas state prison, with parole ineligibility measured at 653 months under the judgment entered in early January of the year 2024. Number 11. Gregory Logan Ramos was a high school sophomore in DeBary, Florida, 15 years old, and living with his mother, Gail Clevenger, when an ordinary household dispute hardened into a case that stunned Central Florida. Friends remembered Gail as devoted, organized, and protective, the kind of parent who monitored grades and set clear rules. Gregory was known as bright and tech-inclined, but increasingly frustrated by school expectations. To neighbors, they looked like a typical single-parent family finding a rhythm after difficult years. Inside the home, according to investigators, tension centered on slipping grades, discipline, and a teenager pushing hard against limits. Through the autumn of 2018, those frictions grew sharper. Authorities later described a pattern of arguments about a bad grade, a grounding order, and the loss of online privileges. Prosecutors would say the conflict was not a single flashpoint but a steady escalation. When deputies eventually examined digital records, They found a timeline of messages and activity that, in the state's telling, underscored planning rather than panic. That context became crucial when the story first presented to law enforcement did not match what the house and the evidence would soon reveal. In the first days of November of that year, Gail Clevenger stopped answering calls. Gregory reported a break-in and staged signs of a ransacked home, even asking two friends to help create the appearance of a burglary, according to investigators. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office quickly treated the situation as suspicious. Detectives noticed inconsistencies, traced movements, and recovered evidence that led them to a church property in nearby DeBerry, where the search ended. During interrogation, Gregory confessed, telling investigators there had been an argument about grades and that he acted afterward, then attempted to cover it up. The grim discovery reshaped a missing persons concern into a homicide investigation that moved with remarkable speed. Prosecutors charged Gregory as an adult with first-degree murder, along with tampering with evidence and abuse of a body. The case drew widespread attention because of Gregory's youth, the alleged motive, and the sophisticated staging for someone so young. In December of 2020, he pleaded guilty to all counts, foregoing a trial. At a sentencing hearing in late January of 2021, the court weighed his age, the seriousness of the offenses, victim impact statements, and expert input about adolescent brain development. The judge imposed a prison term of 45 years, a sentence structured under Florida law to be reviewable after 25 years because he was a juvenile at the time, followed by lifetime probation upon release. Local outlets noted that friends who helped after the fact received probationary sentences in separate proceedings. Psychologically, the portrait that emerged came from interviews, deputies' statements, and courtroom summaries. A teenager under academic pressure, angry at restrictions, and determined to regain control of his online life. Investigators emphasized his confession and the steps taken to stage a break-in, suggesting a mindset focused on concealment rather than shock. The defense pointed to youth, immaturity, and the possibility of rehabilitation over decades. The prosecution countered with the methodical post-incident actions and the weight of physical and digital evidence. Reporters covering the hearings noted a striking detail at sentencing. Gregory addressed the court, saying he would not offer excuses and asking for forgiveness, a statement that underscored the emotional divide between accountability and irreversible harm. Today, according to court records and news reports, Gregory Logan Ramos is incarcerated in Florida state custody, serving a sentence of 45 years with judicial review after 25 years and with lifetime probation ordered upon eventual release.
And Your Honor, the terms of the plea agreement that's outlined as being a conditional plea is for Mr. Ramos to be adjudicated guilty on counts 1, 2, and 3 of the indictment. The sentence for count 1 is 45 years in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections, followed by lifetime probation. Probation will have the standard condition with the special condition of a mental health evaluation with a requirement to complete any recommended treatment and to take any medications as prescribed.
Number 12. Terrell Lamont Johnson was in his mid-30s when he was living at his mother's home just outside Wiggins, Mississippi. His mother, Sherry Johnson, was a well-liked school guidance counselor known for steady kindness, careful attention to her students, and a habit of checking in on neighbors. Friends described a devoted parent who tried to help an adult son manage day-to-day life. From the street, the home looked quiet and ordinary. Inside, according to prosecutors, simmering resentments and financial disputes had begun to harden into constant conflict. Through late spring and into early summer of 2018, the relationship between mother and son faltered. Investigators would later recount statements about arguments and shifting stories that, in hindsight, signaled an increasingly volatile household. When relatives stopped hearing from Sherry for several days, worry turned into action. They asked deputies to conduct a welfare check. That request set in motion a sequence of events that would shape a case the community would not forget. Deputies arrived at the property and encountered Terrell, who told them his mother was away on a cruise. Inside, a locked bedroom and evidence of a violent struggle told a different story. The search soon widened to the backyard, where investigators discovered Sherry's remains. Without dwelling on graphic details, detectives later described efforts to conceal what had happened on the property. The scene, paired with inconsistencies in Terrell's account, shifted the investigation from a missing person concern to a homicide case focused on the person with proximity, opportunity, and motive. He was arrested soon after and charged with murder. What followed, years later, was a brief but closely watched trial in Stone County. Prosecutors presented the welfare check timeline, the discovery at the home, and statements indicating that Terrell had admitted responsibility during the initial investigation. The defense urged jurors to consider an insanity verdict and offered expert testimony to support that claim. The state countered with its own evaluation, arguing that Terrell understood his actions and took steps to mislead authorities. After hearing the evidence, jurors rejected the insanity defense and found him guilty of murder in the first degree. Reporting at the time noted that deliberations were swift, underscoring how the physical evidence and statements fit the prosecution's narrative. At sentencing in late August of 2024, the court imposed life in prison. The order reflected the jury's verdict and the judge's conclusion that the crime was deliberate and aggravated by efforts to disguise it. Local coverage emphasized the loss felt at Sherry's school, where colleagues and former students remembered her patience and steady counsel, and the disbelief across a small community confronted with a killing inside a family home. Officials announced the outcome publicly. Regional outlets amplified the news across Mississippi. Psychologically, the portrait that emerges from filings, courtroom summaries, and press briefings is of a household where dependency and anger collided. Prosecutors framed motive around control, resentment, and an escalating argument that ended in lethal violence, followed by concealment. The defense sought to shift responsibility to mental illness, but the state's expert evaluation and the actions taken before and after the killing persuaded jurors that Terrell was criminally responsible. In the end, the case did not rest on one spectacular clue. It turned on the steady weight of small facts: the inconsistent story about a trip, the locked room, the discovery on the property, and the expert assessments that narrowed what had really happened. Terrell Lamont Johnson is serving a sentence of life imprisonment in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections.